How's it going, everyone? Welcome back to Borlai Hobby Time. I was at my local hobby store the other day and I decided I needed to make an army. But not just any army, I decided to make what's hopefully going to be the wild westiest Space Marine army that you've ever seen. I started with this box of Reavers. I chose these guys because none of them have full helmets, making it easier to add hats later on. Once they were out of the box, I looked through the instruction manual, which didn't include the Cowboy customization option, so it looks like I'll be on my own for this one. I removed the figures from their sprues and immediately jumped into the customizations. I chopped up a bolter to free this guy's left hand, which will be holding the grip of his new old Wild Western gun. I also scalped this little cowboy straight off the top. The easiest way I found to do that was to use my God Hand nippers, make a nice quick clean slice. I proceeded to flatten the heads and make additional customizations to the rest of the 10 Marines, and then I swept them aside to prep the cavalry. I would have preferred that these Space Marines be on horses. I also would have preferred them to be Space Marines, but they were the closest thing that I could find to what I was looking for. I also grabbed a Dreadnought, because it looks cool, and it came with a minigun. I had a lot of options to choose from in terms of weapons, but the rotary cannon is most similar to a Gatling gun, which is definitely the most Wild West of the options provided. After drilling holes in the end of each barrel, I assembled this little ironmonger suit. As expensive as Warhammer figures are, they are super high quality and a lot of fun to put together. They also come with a lot of extra bits, which I threw into my bits box for future kit bashing projects, helping justify the cost a little bit more. After the Dreadnought, I broke out some green stuff to begin the next round of customizations, the first of which was to give facial hair to all of the clean-shaven Marines. I gave this first guy a full beard, and the second guy I gave a nice little Doc Holliday mustache. I also removed the emblems from their chests so that bandanas would fit nicely. Once sculpted, I trimmed all of the bandanas to a nice clean triangle. I also gave one guy a poncho, because at least one of these cowboys needed a poncho. I gave it to this guy, who has some nice manly mutton chops. Off camera, I sculpted and printed some lever-action rifles and revolvers in heroic scale. I also made some spurs in heroic scale, which might be my favorite customization feature on these guys. The other contender for favorite feature are, of course, these tiny little cowboy hats. I proceeded to add weapons, spurs, hats, bandanas, and facial hair to the rest of the Marines and the Wolves, and this little red guy here, which was a gift from one of my patrons, Jahan, Lord of Cats. Once all of the cowboys were outfitted as such, it was time to move on to building the big guy. This not-so-very miniature comes with a bunch of pieces and is just like assembling any other Gundam kit. Although it is not snap fit, so it took me a lot longer than usual. It took me about 3 hours to get it fully assembled. I gave it some custom posing with one leg up on a little rocky ledge, which hyperextended his inner thigh ligament, which I had to replace with a styrene rod. The only thing better than one minigun is a double-decker minigun, and this giant Excalibur that comes with the mini is actually fused with the hand, which is the same thing that happened to that guy from Quest for Camelot. These giant knights are controlled, Pacific Rim style, by a pilot with a mind link. So of course I needed my pilot to have a cowboy hat because this is a cowboy army after all. After encasing him in his little throne box, I wrapped up the rest of the assembly of the knight. This was my first knight that I've ever put together, and I had a lot of fun with it. But because it was my first knight, I didn't think to keep all the armor plates off until the end. I did with a few to make it easier to paint. These other ones are cemented permanently, so I'll just have to work around those. The next step was to make some custom bases. I broke out some balsa wood, and I made some simple wooden flooring, like the inside of a saloon. Or really any building that has a wooden floor, for that matter. I then trimmed off the excess balsa that was sticking over the edge of the base, and I gave the balsa a little bit more character by using a wire brush to bring out the grain. And finally, I sliced up some very thin styrene and pushed it into the wood to look like little nail heads. This base right here is supposed to look like the edge of a boardwalk, so I had some visible dirt on the other side. I made a variety of other bases, both with wooden flooring and with some dirt texture, and then I moved on to the basing of the medium-sized figures. I glued this guy in place, and I gave him a very simple base starting with Mod Podge, followed by 2 different texture paints from Citadel. Starting with Mod Podge was a tip that I got from a guy at my local hobby store, and it definitely helps the texture paint stay put once it's dry. The next wolf riding cowboy got a small plaster rock, followed by more ground texture and a little wagon wheel to help sell the setting a little bit further. I knew for the base of my dreadnought that I wanted him to be standing on a small bit of railroad track, so I placed down some balsa wood ties, I ran a track over top, which is a styrene I-beam, and then I filled it all in with some gray ballast. Once the ballast had been sprinkled in place, I sealed it with some watered down white glue and isopropyl alcohol. After that was mostly dry, I glued the dreadnought in place, and I'm really happy with the way that this base looks. I also added some bison horns, because that seemed like it would be fitting for a Wild Western dreadnought. After all of the medium bases had been completed, it was time to work on the big one. I glued a thin sheet of XPS foam in place using some foam safe superglue, and then I trimmed off the excess using my utility knife. Once that was done, I carved up a rock off camera and I applied a small bit of texture paste to the lower section of the base. When this texture paint dries, it becomes nice and crackly, lending to a deserty look. On the other side of the lower section of this base, I broke up and glued some balsa wood pieces into position. The idea is that this knight just crushed a wagon or cart. After that step, all of the base customization was done, and it was time to move on to priming the minis. And as I begin painting these, I'd like to give a huge shout out to all of my patrons. I primed all of the minis and their bases with an acrylic primer from the airbrush. Once they had all been primed black, I added a layer of purple to bring some color and some life into the shadows. After the purple, I began layering on the warmer mid-tones, applied pretty generally but primarily from above. Next, I hit everything with an almost white highlight, being much more careful with the application. Once that had been applied, I began blocking in all of the standalone colors that I didn't have the bravery to apply with an airbrush. Once all the bandanas, hats, and leather details had been picked out, I moved on to some oil washes. I especially focused these on the bases and the fur of the wolves. I used a combination of blue, purple, orange, and burnt umber oil washes to paint everything, leaning more into the warmer colors for the highlights and the cooler colors for the shadows. I gave some additional attention to the dreadnought with those purple and bluish washes in the dark areas, and then I dabbed off the excess using a Q-tip. I then moved on to some edge highlights and some dry brushing. To tie this paint job together nicely, I applied a sepia glaze over all of the existing highlights, making sure everything appeared to be getting hit by the same light source. I then painted some final highlights in the standalone elements and finally gave the minis a coat of purple red wash from below to give the armor an almost sunburst appearance. With all of the small and medium figures painted, it was time to begin working on the big boy. I realized I didn't do much customization on the knight itself to make it Wild West. All I did was change the pose and add stuff to the base, but I did try to accomplish the Western theme using the paint job. The idea was to give the knight the coloration of an 1800s steam train, which meant that all of the large panels were painted black and all of the trim was painted with brass. In the end, I don't think the brass communicates as brass, which probably would have helped it look more like a steam engine, but I really like the paint job. I think it looks pretty cool. The other accent color that you'd see on a steam engine is a bright, flashy red, like you'd see on the cattle guard or on the wheels. I painted that little grill and the sword with that bright red, because both of those looked like elements on a steam train that would be red. I then put the carapace armor in carapace and I applied the reddish purple glaze to the gold and the bluish one to all of the lower sections on the black armor. It was at this point that the brass stopped looking like brass, but it did match the rest of the army better. I then moved over to a brush and I added some edge highlights to help define more of the shapes that get a little lost in the dark paint job of this figure. I also added highlights to the wood of the crushed wagon as well, and I added the Boylai Hobby Time cattle brand to the flag. I made this BHT monogram in my revolver video from a couple weeks ago. To further spice up the base of the big guy, I added a little cattle skull that I sculpted from clay. After that had been baked, I primed it and I painted it. After a coat of bone white, I applied a skeleton horde wash, I painted the horns black, gave it some highlights, and I glued it in place. To wrap up this project, I painted the rims of all of these little dioramas with some black 4.0. The very last thing to do was to stick my big steam engine knight into position. Once that had been glued in place, I called it good. That is it for this video. Thank you all so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed. Huge shout out as always to my patrons. You guys are the best. I'm going to put this little army on display at my local hobby store if you'd like to see it in person. The details for that will be below. Have an awesome week, everyone. I'll see you next time.